Welcome to Connect and Transform. In this video, we're going to start a series where we're creating a game of checkers from scratch in an SVG using XML and JavaScript. In the first episode here, we're just going to be creating the board. It should go pretty quick. We're going to start by just creating a new text document, and we're going to name it checkers board.svg. We'll go ahead and open that in our text editor and in our browser. We'll go back to the text editor on the right-hand side here, and we're going to create a root element SVG. The SVG needs a couple of attributes. One of them is the XML namespace, which is essentially a hard-coded string. And I don't know if it's good or bad that I have that memorized, but it is. We're also going to give the SVG canvas a width and a height. And since we know the checkers board is going to be 8 by 8, I think we're just going to keep the math simple and say that each square is 100 by 100. The actual value doesn't really matter in an SVG because by definition, unless you define things in pixels, they are vector graphics and they scale. Hence, scalable vector graphics SVG. So width and height of the total canvas will be 800. We're going to create a group element in the SVG to hold the board. We're going to give it an ID. We're just going to keep it simple and call it board. The ID will help us reference this element in the future in JavaScript. We're going to go ahead and create a script tag. And just for completeness, we're going to go ahead and give it that type of application JavaScript. Okay, so what is the script going to do? Well, the script is going to generate a board. So we're going to have a function, and we're just going to call it generate board. And it would help if I could type. There we go. So we're going to call this function when the page loads. And then in the process of generating the board, we're going to basically be generating SVG elements, and then we're going to be sticking them inside of this board element. So the things that we're going to be creating, we're just going to be creating 8 by 8, so 64 total rectangles that will happen to also be squares. Now, in the process of creating SVG elements, you do need to reference the SVG namespace, which is this exact string that I've highlighted here. I might be a little bit fancy in this case, and instead of just copying the string, we're going to use JavaScript to query this root element and get this attribute value here. It's complete overkill. It's not really a good way of doing it, but I'm just going to do it to demonstrate how you query an element. So we're going to call this an SVG because that's the SVG namespace. And we're going to do document.querySelector. You could also do document.getElementById. Query selector is a little more generic. And so we're just going to go by the element's name, which is SVG. So it'll go ahead and grab the first SVG in the document, which is exactly what we want. And then we're going to say get attribute. And the attribute that we're getting is XML NS, which is right here. So this whole line number 4, all it's doing is getting this string value and assigning it to that variable that we can now reference in the script. So how are we going to go about creating the board? Well, the board is going to be 8 by 8. So the simplest way is to just have a nested loop. So you have an outer loop, an inner loop, and then each of these is going to change from 1 to 8 inclusive or 0 to 7 inclusive. So I'll start at 0, and then we'll go make sure that x is less than 8. You'll notice that I escaped the less than symbol. There are a few symbols in SVGs that must be escaped, and one of them is the less than symbol because it's also the opening symbol for a new tag. Okay, so what we've just defined here is that x is going to loop from 0 through 7, inclusive on both ends, a total of 8 values. So we're just going to copy that and change x to y. Okay, so now we have x and y that each go from 0 to 7, 0 to 7. So now we're going to begin creating our square. So we're just going to name it square. So we created a new variable called square, and that is going to equal we're going to create an element, and then the element needs to take a namespace. So in this case, we've already defined that. And then we need to tell it what type of element to create. So we're going to create a rect element called square. And when we're done creating it, we are going to append it to the board element. So we're going to query for the board. And probably this would be more efficient to just do this once outside of the loop and then just reference that variable. So in fact, maybe we will do that just to try and do a little bit of decent coding. Now I hesitate to do this because it's essentially creating a global variable. I don't know that we really need any more of those, but let's proceed anyway. So, okay, now we've got this board constant, which is going to reference this board element in the SVG. Okay, so after we create our square, we want to append the square to the board. And so that's what this line does. Now we still need to set a bunch of attributes for each square. So the set attribute function takes two parameters. One is the attribute that you're setting. Let's say it's the ID, and then the second will be the actual value. So I'm going to start the value with a B for board, and then when we add pieces, I'll probably make the ID start with a P for a piece. And the reason I don't start it with just a number is technically you're not supposed to. Doesn't mean that it won't work in some browsers. And then we're also going to append the x and y coordinates separated by underscores so that we could parse those back out if we need to without necessarily having to store those as separate data attributes. But we might end up storing these as data attributes later. So we've set our ID to something like, so 0, 0 would be B underscore 0 underscore 0, and the square on the lower right, which is 7, 7, that would be B underscore 7 underscore 7. Okay, so we've set our ID. What else do we need to set? We need to set an X. And the X value, you'll remember that each piece is 100 by 100, and it's starting at 0. So that is just going to be, for the X, it's going to be X times 100. And then same for Y. Okay, and then we also need to set a width and a height, which are going to be static values equal precisely to 100. So now we've got X positioning, Y positioning, width and height all set. And then we need to set probably a class name and a color. We'll come back to that. So now we need to determine whether a square is light or dark. So we know there's going to be some if else. And it's either going to be light or dark. Okay, so let's say it's the dark one. And we'll just start with a really light gray here for the light. So E, that's a gray and it's very close to white. For the dark one, I'm thinking we probably want to have some amount of color, but maybe we could just do a darker gray, but I'm going to do 7, 8, 9 because 7 and 8 are right around the middle point of hexadecimal. And these numbers are for red, red, green, green, and blue, blue. So by doing 7, 8, 9, there's slightly more blue than there is the others and slightly more green still than the red. So this will be a mostly blue, slightly green, but overall very gray color. So now we just have to determine how do we differentiate the light and dark squares? Well, that's going to be based on taking the sum of the x and y coordinates. So we're going to say x plus y modulo 2. And when you do modulo 2, you're basically saying give me the remainder when divided by 2, which by definition will either be 0 or 1. Now I might have to change this 0 to a 1. Let's save that, refresh. Okay, so that does it for the board. Let me demonstrate real quick. If I change this to a 1, that's going to basically invert the light and dark squares. Now, I do like it the way that it was initially, so I'm going to change it back. But that's really it. So we've created a checkers board on an 800 by 800 canvas. We've created a single element directly in SVG, calling it board. And then in JavaScript, we're calling this generate board function, the bulk of which is a nested loop going from 0 to 8, 0 to 8, 64 total combinatory values. And for each of those 64, we are creating a rectangle. We're setting a number of positioning, width, and height values, as well as an ID. And we are determining whether or not to classify it as a light or a dark square. And then in each of those cases, we are setting a class name so that we can later reference those either in JavaScript or in CSS if we need to. And we're also filling them with blue-gray and light gray values. And then once we've done that, we're appending the board, the square that we've created to the board. So that's it for creating a board in a checkers board in SVG. In the next episode, we're going to create the pieces. So we'll be creating the red piece, the black piece, the kinged red piece, and the kinged black piece. Thanks for watching.